Hello, my name is Enrique Gomez. I am president of the Jackson County, North Carolina branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And I want to thank Mountain Stream TV for allowing me this opportunity to address you about an issue of concern that affects our community as well as our country. And the name of the presentation is After Charlottesville, Thoughts on Community-Based Solutions to Political Violence. So we are being deeply affected even many weeks after for an event that happened or a series of events that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. This was a unity rally led by white nationalist groups to rally around a statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville in the University of Virginia over there. And you can see, for instance, that the fact that I'm still talking to you about that there have been a lot of very painful conversations, not just in the public, but also in online communities and just face-to-face that people are having, and particularly here in the South. Now, what's interesting here is that as a result of these violent events that cause fatalities, a lot of people have gone out to try to identify by name the people that have appeared in many of the pictures collected by the press, with an effort to actually bring shame and identify the name to their friends and families and employers as well. And even though this is something that can happen in a liberal democracy, this is not censorship. This is opprobrium. This is mobilizing our community's sentiments and value system as a response to things that we find abhorrent. However, I'm actually interested in ways in which can actually prevent this from happening. How to dissuade people to actually take seriously the ideological position of far-right groups, particularly those that espouse violence against certain races and in particular groups. And what's going to happen is that all these groups are essentially going to go underground again. At least that's what the strategy aims to do. And what I want to submit to you is that if we're at this stage right now in 2017, that perhaps many of the things that we have done so far hasn't been as effective as we think they've been effective. And maybe we need to start thinking about things in a slightly different way. But before I start jumping about statues, which is really what these groups have been pressing us to think about statues of metal and stone. Let me enumerate really quickly all the things that we should be talking about that we are not talking about when we're talking about statues. For instance, it should be a priority in our country to talk about policing and criminal justice reform. Why? Because by teaching police de-escalation techniques as well as community policing, that we reduce fatalities and a lot of the tensions that are driving a lot of racial animosity in recent years. We need to talk about immigration reform. Why? Because we have a large population of people that do not have access and protections to services, people who are part of our community. And if you participate in the building of this country and you participate in the life of the nation, there should be a humane and compassionate pathway for you to become citizen of the United States. We need to talk about living wages and income inequality. The greater the degree of income inequality in a country, the more politically unstable it becomes. Why? Because fewer and fewer people have access to the resources needed in order to improve the quality of their lives. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about racial gerrymandering and voter suppression, particularly in the state of North Carolina. We need to protect our rights. Why? Because if people lose faith in the political system, because it becomes so insurmountable with uncompetitive races, then it becomes a more difficult place to live and for us to exercise our values in a democracy. And this is, by the way, something that both major parties, both the Republican and the Democrats have been guilty of. We need to address the issue of racial gerrymandering and racial voter suppression. We need to talk about quality, accessible education for all people, because this is the pathway by which people can improve the quality of their lives and improve our communities. And right now we are falling behind, and we are in a position where we are almost defunding the education system that we have, and that is a very dangerous path for us. We need to talk about healthcare. This is what we have about. We have serious discussions, and a lot of people are falling through the gaps. And if we cannot take care of our own by providing meaningful, affordable, quality healthcare for all of us citizens, then that is a driver of inequality and unneeded human suffering among our fellow citizens. We need to talk about the dismantling of our rural healthcare infrastructure. And this is something that the state NAACP as well as our Jackson County NAACP has been very deeply concerned about. Why? Because this is true across the country as well as locally. Services are being cut down, rural hospitals are being defunded. We need to address this, and this is something that affects people of all races and affects the viability of many of our rural communities. And we need to talk about environmental protection. As we're talking about right now, we're still dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in the Texas coast. As a means of talking about, here I have a graphic representation of what it would look like to look at the total precipitation from 2 storms over downtown Houston. So this is what Katrina looks like with 6.5 trillion gallons of water precipitation from that storm. And this is what it looks like when you have Harvey with 14 to 15 trillion gallons of water of precipitation landing over there. What is true is that we have increased temperatures, and a lot of this, according to the evidence based upon science, is that it is driven by human activity. We heat up the atmosphere, we increase the amount of moisture in the air from evaporation and the ability of the atmosphere to hold that moisture. So we should expect to have greater events, extreme events of both extreme water and extreme precipitation and extreme drought. And the thing about this is that our infrastructure, both our urban infrastructure, rural infrastructure, transportation, energy, all of that is not currently equipped to handle extreme events in any meaningful fashion. So we need to address this because this is something that is going to affect thousands of generations of Americans, not just the present or the immediate future. So if we don't deal with any of these things, if we don't deal with any of these issues, we ourselves do not deserve any statues at all. We deserve the scorn and the disdain of every generation of Americans that will follow us because we have not done the basic function of being responsible caretakers and stewards of the nation and its future. But the far right wants to talk about stones, so let's talk about monuments and stones. As an example, I took this picture of a monument that we have in downtown Silva, where I live. We have the old Jackson County Courthouse, which has now been adapted as a library and community center, and we have this monument over here. In the back, there is this plaque, and it's worthwhile to sit down and kind of study what's going on with this plaque. It reads out loud: "To our valiant fathers, champions of reconciliation with justice, of union with manhood, of peace with honor. They fought with faithfulness, labored with cheerfulness, and suffered in silence. To our heroic mothers, Spartan in devotion, Teuton in sacrifice, in patience superior to either, and in modesty and grace, matchless among womankind." Now, I have no doubt that many of the people that fought for the Confederate States of America in the Civil War were people that were fathers and sons, brothers and friends, people that were much beloved, and they were sorely missed and grieved for generations after their passing and after they lived through the struggles of both the Civil War as well as Reconstruction. Okay, with that, I think that it makes sense to have a monument to actually acknowledge that particular experience of those men. Another thing that's problematic, though, about this particular image is that you have, for instance, various symbols. Symbols, for instance, to the Confederacy. The CSA being the initials immediately below the statue. The banner that we recognize as the rebel flag, the flag of the Confederacy, right there present very prominently in the pedestal, as well as our heroes of the Confederacy. Now, the thing about this is that this statue was not actually erected right away after the Civil War. It was erected decades later during a period of time where you have the assertion of an apartheid system that we call now Jim Crow. Thing about monuments is that oppressive regimes need a lot of monuments to justify themselves because oppressive regimes that use police-state violence actually are very expensive to run and to justify to its own citizens. So here what you want to do is that you want to draw an equivalence between the suffer of people in the past with what is needed in the present. Whether in fact that is a valid argument or not, it is something actually that has been settled by historians, as well as the underlying causes of the Civil War and the effects of Reconstruction and Jim Crow after that. So I want you, for instance, to think about what it would have been like to be an African-American man or woman walking up the stairs to the courthouse of Jackson County during the 1920s and 1930s, and wonder as you pass through the statue whether in that courtroom your rights are going to be protected and they are going to be spoken for, or whether you would be allowed to speak on your behalf and that the law will actually honor your rights and recognize you as a full citizen. I'm going to speculate, and I think seems reasonable, that if I were to be that person walking past that statue, that I may choose to actually be silent, which illuminates one of the ways in which these statues, when they're placed in such prominent places, in front of government buildings, in things associated with law enforcement and the law, that this creates an environment that is difficult for someone to actively acknowledge themselves as full citizens and to speak on behalf of their rights. And you face the risk of terror and violence for having spoken for yourself if in fact you have an image that actually honors a particular ideology. And what is that ideology? It is the ideology of complete dominance of one class of people over another based upon their origin. The complete dominance of people from European descent over people of African American descent. People that were the people who actually confected and designed many of the images that are honored here of the Confederacy were actually upholding the idea that people of African American descent were equivalent to animals, that were not capable of reason, that they did not deserve the full rights and benefits of being a citizen of the United States. I'm going to propose to you that if we are going to have monuments in front of our public buildings, in places of prominence, that those structures, those images, those symbols fully uphold our collective moral values and our deepest constitutional principles. It is very difficult for me to look at an image like this or many images that still exist around the country and say that this particular monument actually fully upholds who we are as a nation, what our most fundamental and cherished values are. So then, what is it that we should do and we should propose? The current proposal for many of these monuments, I haven't talked particularly about this monument, but many of these monuments, is that they need to be placed in museums where you actually have a proper historical context, not just of what has been honored, but also why those monuments were erected at the time that they were erected. So these are things that I think that we need to very carefully consider and think about. We also have something that is incomplete. This soldier, or the soldiers that were honored in this particular monument over there, by and large were poor Southerners that did not actually own slaves or much property for that matter. Okay? Can we have a space where we actually fully describe their historical experience, what they went through before and after and during the war? Okay, what is it that they actually suffered as a result of the war, but also the fact that they did not have much in terms of economic opportunity because many of their labor was actually artificially depressed because of the existence of slavery, and because you have this tremendous concentration of wealth of people that by and large did not fight alongside them. So we need to have a way in which we can actually speak towards this experience, actually honor fully the sentiments that are presented in the plaque behind, while addressing some of the current effects and historical experience of people that have lived in the shadow of these monuments. So this has been a response. Almost immediately after Charlottesville, there was an incident in which a crowd gathered in a monument in Durham, North Carolina, to tear down a monument to the Confederacy, very much what we have here in Silla. And I suppose we could have a discussion about the legality of this. Currently, these monuments are protected by law in the state of North Carolina, and they cannot be fully removed without approval at the state level. So this is the situation that we have. And I suppose we could have a discussion about the legality of such an action. We could have a discussion, for instance, about whether or not it can be justified for someone who feels this image to be an oppressive image of their person and of their rights to actually take an action such as this. Okay, so here we have, for instance, someone that actually took a picture who was part of this crowd, who actually stood in front of this. And I'm going to submit something for you, that the most difficult or problematic part of this image is not the soldier in the ground. It is not the protester who's standing in front of him. The most problematic image I submit to you is actually the emptiness in the pedestal, what has been left empty behind. If we're going to remove these monuments for a prominent public space, okay, I think that we should be ready to replace that with images and symbols that speak deepest to our deepest values and constitutional principles. And actually, I think that the discussion that we need to have is even far more urgent than what is going to happen to these statues, because there is a dearth of such images, of those symbols, of things that speak collectively towards our collective experience, what our hopes and aspirations are going to be. If we're going to replace the statues, we be ready to put something there so that there be no question at all whatsoever that we have come to a better place as a country and as a people. And this is, for instance, what happened in Baltimore in the week immediately after the incidents in Charlottesville. And someone took the initiative. By the way, Baltimore, the government there actually intentionally replaced the statues to Confederate soldiers around the city. And this happened very quickly, almost overnight. And almost overnight, there was a response. So, for instance, you have an artist here that I went ahead and actually put something that kind of addresses a little bit more of what we're talking about. You know, and this is sort of like an immediate response. I don't know how full a response that is, but it certainly reflects the fact that a lot of people are thinking that, yes, if we're going to replace these monuments, what is it that we're going to replace them with? For instance, in Baltimore as well, there was an incident in which a statue that had been placed previously before, a monument to Lee Ann Jackson, of an African-American woman with children, there as kind of like a contrasting image. And activists actually put that in the pedestal in the empty place where the monuments had been. The thing about this is that this lasted for a little while with lots of people taking pictures of this. But this is where it was the morning immediately after, which means that you still have it was vandalized and was destroyed, and you have very strong response in there, which seems to be that there has to be at least some process, some thought that goes into what is it that we should uphold for in terms of these images. So now let me talk about the brain, and I'm going to say things about the brain and neuroscience, our current understanding of neuroscience, that I think need to be brought to bear into this discussion. And this is something that I really haven't seen anybody else talk about. Now, if I'm going to talk about neuroscience here for just a moment, and how these images, these symbols, these monuments actually play in our mind, my purpose here is just to describe some functioning. My purpose here is not to actually diagnose anybody at all with a mental image, but I think that it can give us a little bit of with a mental disease or a mental condition. But I think that having a conversation along these lines can actually better inform us and have a much more productive conversation. So some course areas that I want to identify, this of course not an exhaustive list of the brain. And here we have, for instance, the limbic system in the bottom right. These are the things that are sort of associated with functioning and memory as well. You have a particular region called the basal ganglia, which is associated with emotions and emotional response. The nucleus accumbens is a place that is associated with pleasure. And here up in the front, right here, we have an area called the prefrontal cortex, which is a place that is associated with executive function, reasoning, as well as awareness of the consequence of your actions in a social context. So I think that at this point right here, with all the evidence that we have mustered, both by historians and people who actually care about historical evidence, I think we have pretty much settled the argument within that space about what the value of these monuments are in our community. The thing about this, though, is that the responses that we're seeing are not being processed in the same part of the brain. So, for instance, in the prefrontal cortex, if this is the place that's associated with decision-making and motoring social behavior, along with the frontal cortex, which is the part that allows you to do reasoning, All of these parts right here is what is needed for you to actually make morally informed decisions, having moral reasoning. The basal ganglia, for instance, is the place that's associated with emotion, with memory and pattern recognition. And what's interesting to me about this, this representation of looking at the brain is that these parts of the brain are actually not in contact with each other, which means that whatever happens in the prefrontal cortex, somehow at some level, it's going to take some time and effort to actually be processed in the basal ganglia. Likewise, whatever emotions, memory, pattern, things that really drive things having to do with emotional response. You know, when we're talking about things coming from the heart, often what we're doing is we're talking about activities having to do with the basal ganglia. Somehow there's got to be some kind of connection we can draw between those two. Now, one of the things that, for instance, we could do, if we're talking about memory and pattern recognition, is this. Let's consider the Confederate flag, right? You and I, you know, if we lived in the continental US, we have at least one neuron whose entire job is dedicated to that particular symbol, to identify that particular symbol. We have the same thing for any number of symbols, like stop signs, so that we are able to recognize what to do if we're driving and encounter a stop sign. You know, we have things for just about every single symbol. Some symbols are more important than others, and hence we'll have a different set of connections. Now, walk with me here for just a moment. Let's suppose, for instance, that I am a person that identifies very strongly with Southern heritage, and I have a neuron whose job it is to recognize and activate circuits whenever there's a presence of the Confederate flag. The question is, what are going to be the things, what are going to be the neurons that are going to fire together along with that neuron dedicated to that Confederate flag? And I propose that this could in fact be true. Maybe the things that light up at the same time as the Confederate flag would be things like, say, family. All right, or close associating with family, or having fun, you know, or sports events, or music, and all the emotions that are connected with music. We could do any number of things, and all these things are associated. The thing about this, though, is what happens and what lights up when that Confederate flag appears within our field of view, and you see something happen to it. So, for instance, let's suppose, for instance, that you are witnessing the destruction of the Confederate flag or any kind of monument to the Confederacy. What's going to light up? You know, those parts of the brain, the limbic system in particular, cannot distinguish. If you have, for instance, family and the Confederate flag lighting up together and you see one of them destroyed, your limbic system cannot distinguish whether, you know, it is really your a family, someone who you care for, that you care for really deeply being hurt, or maybe you yourself are being hurt, and this particular flag right there. They light up together. They cannot make that distinguishing. The distinguishing part comes when it happens right here in the prefrontal cortex. But it takes some time for that processing to happen right over there. So you feel an emotion. You feel it in your gut. You have an emotional response. And the question is this a moral failing? And I want to propose to you that this is by itself not a moral failing. Just having these things slide up together like they do is not a moral failing. The moral failing comes with the failure of reasoning that happens in the frontal cortex. So we have to talk about this. You know, while myself, I did not grow up in the South. You know, I don't particularly identify with the Southern culture, although I am very glad and very happy to live in the South, to participate in the life of that community. And I think that I want to help this community and this culture survive, thrive, and excel. And I feel Southerners to be my fellow human beings, my fellow citizens, who I care for and love very much. However, what my own experiences be is that if you have, for instance, if I myself, I witness see the Confederate flag in any context, the feelings that emerge, the memories that light up in the limbic system around the basal ganglia would have to be of fear, of memories of being excluded, of being ridiculed because of my accent or my national origin. Those are the things that trigger. You know, those are the things that light up. And is that a moral failing? And I'm going to submit to you is that that's not a moral failing either. It simply is. It's simply what is going on. The thing about this, though, is that if I see that image over there, at some point I have to come over here to the prefrontal cortex to assess whether I myself, I'm safe or not. Most of the time, I can make an assessment that in fact I'm going to be safe, that I do not have to engage the circuits in the brain associated with fight or flight. I'm going to be okay. But let's suppose, for instance, that this is a regular feature of my landscape all around that, and imagine what it takes. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of potential interactions in which I myself have to make a determination whether I am safe or not. And that kind of builds up and creates an expectation that maybe I am not welcome in this environment and that other people that I care about very deeply are not welcome either, right? But you may want to come to a person that, for instance, flies a Confederate flag in the back of their truck or in front of their house, and you ask them, well, what is the purpose behind you saying that, flying that particular symbol? One of the things that you could do, for instance, is say that, well, I am not racist, I'm just really honoring my heritage. You could say that. The thing about this is that my limbic system is not aware of that. I haven't had a conversation with you about what that image particularly represents. So am I safe coming into your space, be around your truck or your car or around your house? That is something that I have to make a determination for. Okay. Another thing that happens is that, there are people out there that would say when pressed that they are doing it mainly to honor their heritage. They are not themselves being racist, but they themselves at some level might think, they might even derive pleasure over the prospect of causing discomfort over someone that looks different from them. That is a problem too that we kind of have to address. But now let's come back and talk more about what is going on and how are we going to address this problem if we're talking about specific brain structures. So you see the amygdala, the basal ganglia, things having to do with emotional distress and yearning. You have the anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsal prefrontal cortex. This is the part that's responsible for moral reasoning, as well as defining and moderating social interaction. What's interesting, though, is that there is a part of the brain that is connected, that actually connects all of these areas together. The amygdala, the basal ganglia, the prefrontal cortex, all of these things kind of working together. And that would be the hippocampus. And the main function of the hippocampus has to do with learning and memory. Learning and memory and kind of building things together. We know, for instance, that people who have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, whether they are soldiers in a battlefield, that have gone to war, or who have gone through some kind of natural disaster, or you could even get symptoms of PTSD for being in an abusive household growing up as a child, is that sometimes you develop parts of the brain or show memories that you develop actually two different types of memories. You have explicit memory and you have implicit memory. With explicit memory, something you know happened in the past. Why? Because you have processed that through the hippocampus. You have had an experience, it's been processed through the hippocampus, and now you are aware that this is something that happened in the past, and you have a narrative, a story that's connected to that. However, if you have experienced a traumatic effect, you may develop instead something called an implicit memory, meaning that there are still structures in the brain around the limbic system who are responsible for responding and alerting situation looks like them. But the thing about this is that information, those neural connections, have not been processed through the hippocampus. So you are not aware, or those parts of the brain are not aware that you have moved on to a different part of your life. So if, for instance, you have suffered through warfare, whether as a soldier or a civilian, and you have a traumatic experience associated with from bomb blasts or something like that. Some of those memories have not been processed through the hippocampus, so that the next time further in your life, when you're in a place that's safer and you listen fireworks from a celebration, those parts of the brain are actually experiencing those memories and are processing situation in danger. Why? Because that information, those things have not actually been integrated through the hippocampus. And the way you do it, that you want to seek therapy, one way to do this is to go through a process of connecting with those memories, going to that past, and actually make those connections and actually building up a narrative, creating a story by which you understand your reactions, where they come from, what they do, and how they make sense. And it seems that a big part of it has to do with being able to have a narrative. And this is the thing that I think it's missing with a lot of the symbols, because we do not have fully acknowledged narrative about the experience of slavery, of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, of the civil rights period and the Jim Crow law and our present time. We still, not all of us are actually on the same page. The historians with historical evidence might actually have that, but we as society haven't. So it seems to me that it is imperative for us to actually seek out and build up a self-consistent, historically supported narrative of where we have been that actually informs who we are as a people and where we want to go from there. So it is useful to actually talk about how something like this has happened in the past. And what I'm showing you is a completely different circumstance. And I'm showing you, for instance, the late South African president, Nelson Mandela, who was an activist with the African National Congress, ANC, who spent decades in prison and actually emerged out of this and actually led the efforts to actually end apartheid in South Africa, a place that at the time in the early 90s looked like it was about to fall apart as a country. It was about to fail as a country because you had such high level of animosity across races, across ethnic groups, across languages. It was a very serious thing. And I want to submit to you that whether he understood this explicitly or implicitly, that he did all of the things I'm talking to you then, specifically with brain science, in terms of bringing things together. This is a very highly significant image. What am I showing you here? Here you have the late president of South Africa, President Mandela, a year into his administration, the first post-apartheid government of South Africa. And he's trying to bring the country together. What is he doing? He is wearing the jersey of the Springboks, the South African national rugby team. And why is this significant? Because rugby and the Springboks were strongly associated with white South Africa, the Afrikaans. It was a symbol of apartheid. The Bantu, the black people of South Africa, by and large, did not have any interest in rugby because they were systematically excluded because it was seen as something that did not belong to them. So here he is actually seeking a way, as President of South Africa, reaching out, and actively supporting and cheering and being seen emotionally celebrating whenever the South African team actually, and eventually ended up defeating New Zealand to win the Rugby World Cup in 1995. Okay. So a lot of images and things that he did are actually very interesting. And we can look, for instance, at some of the symbols of South Africa to see how many of the things actually work together. So, for instance, we can consider the national anthem of South Africa, which I want to show you in a moment. This is from the 2010 game, and you have the anthem of South Africa. And if you could please look at these images very carefully, this video very carefully, to see how it all works, to see how it actually works together and what are the emotional responses and who actually responds there. What's interesting about this anthem here is that of the languages. See how many languages you can recognize in the national anthem of South Africa.
Sigillela
There are 5 languages in the national anthem of South Africa. You have, for instance, Xhosa, you have Zulu, you have Sesotho, you have Afrikaans, and you have English at the very end. And what you have here is that you have the melding of 2 melodies that were highly significant for the Black liberation movement in South Africa, as well as for the Afrikaans people. What's interesting about this also is that all of these ethnic groups at various times during the past several hundred years actually did very serious atrocities to each other. You know, there is a lot of memory that needs to be processed there. And what happens with this anthem is that when you bring those 2 melodies together, all of these languages together, and you make people stand up and sing it, you know, if you have, for instance, you have Xhosa, you will have to sing in Sesotho and Zulu, as well as Afrikaans and English, okay? And you're going to see people who are different from you, who speak other languages, sing a song which is actually very precious to you, right? And by extension, if you see someone sing a song that's very precious to you, they themselves become precious to you. So they become part of your narrative, the story of who you are, and you're bringing yourself closer to the people. Likewise, if you have someone who is Afrikaans, who see a Black South African singing the call of Africa, singing in the words in the Afrikaans language, you know, a language that was sustained by Black South Africans who resisted having to sing that song during the apartheid years, all of a sudden you see them, and because they are singing a song that is precious to you, that fits within the story and narrative of who you are, they themselves become precious to you. So that's one of the things that kind of works together. So, for instance, you see this, you know, and you have, for instance, this 2007 image, and he came as Nelson Mandela, after becoming president, continued to become drive the image and drive and bring South Africans together and offer people a vocabulary, a visual vocabulary, as well as a language by which they can actually talk about their collective experience as South Africans, and hence become one nation as opposed to something that is completely fractured. So let's talk, for instance, more about symbols, and for instance, very prominent symbols. So these 2 flags I'm showing you here, I'm showing you the flag and the colors of the African National Congress. And then you have the flag of apartheid South Africa before 1994. What's interesting is that these 2 images, these 2 flags were seen in opposition with each other. And a lot of people struggled with to see how, for instance, you could actually make a country where both of these narratives, both of these stories can actually be brought together. And indeed, they actually made an effort and they had to struggle with it. So this is what the flag of South Africa actually looks like right now. And if you study it very carefully, you see the colors both of the African National Congress as well as the colors that you see of the old apartheid South Africa. And this gives rise to the nickname of South Africa that you hear often, the idea of the Rainbow Nation, the South of South Africa today. Now, this, of course, having a flag that brings all these things together by itself, it doesn't solve the problem. South Africa still has many serious problems to begin with, but at least many of these images, both the flag as well as the national anthem, actually produce a scaffold by which you can actually begin to build up this idea of a collective total national identity by bringing all the stories together, by giving them a place of honor within their national symbols as well. Now what I'm going to do is do as follows, is that I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to do an experiment, and the outcome of the experiment is not nearly as important as the underlying logic you have. And I think that this logic, this approach, can actually help inform our discussion about what are going to be the symbols that are going to show stand-in and add up and bring our sense of national unity and actually give us a good sense of where we as a country are going to be, and how Southern culture can actually not just continue, but also continue to thrive by actually acknowledging the historical experience of very different people that right now they are perceived to be at odds with each other. So for instance, this is my own invention. I actually invented this a couple years ago as an exercise, primarily as an exercise. This flag, which I am calling the flag of Southern Reconciliation, is not meant to be a flag of a country. It is not meant to be a flag of a particular people. It is more like to be a shorthand for a particular idea. The idea of what it would take to actually bring symbols of and have people and come in to actually acknowledge their historical experience, what they have gone through together, and actually speak with a common vocabulary. So if you look at this flag, you would see, for instance, still the flag of St. Andrew, which features prominently not just in the rebel flag, but also many of the flags in southern states. But if you look at carefully, you will see, for instance, the same colors, and that's our national colors as well, red, white, and blue. But you also see another set of colors. You see red, green, and black. These are the colors of the Pan-African flag of the Pan-African movement, which is a very powerful symbol, very rich symbol for a lot of people that are trying to assert the or reconcile and reconnect with their African heritage. You also see another color as well. You have yellow, and there I include yellow because it's a primary color, but also something that features prominently in many flags of American Indians, Native American nations. There what you see is that we also need to acknowledge the historical experience of Native Americans in the South, the Trail of Tears, the systematic ethnic cleansing that happened in many of these communities, and that we are standing often in the South in many places that were of rich significance of communities of Native Americans going back centuries, if not millennia. At some point, we need to talk about this process of reconciliation and acknowledgement. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is that, yes, we still have the flag of St. Andrew. This flag of Andrew also shows up in many places that acknowledge a connection with English and Scottish heritage as well. So it is something that's present over there. One of the things I kind of like about this is that somewhere, I do have a connection, as a man who identifies Latino with this particular flag. And that is that this rectangle with a cross, just as it shows up there, is a symbol that shows up in a lot of Mesoamerican iconography, particularly the idea of the sky. So you see all this, what are called sky bands in Maya and Aztec and Zapotec and Mixtec communities as well, and that is a symbol that is represented there as the Omashali, as a crossroad, as a place that is the center, as a place that is the reconciliation between opposites and brings everything into a whole. Now, this flag, of course, is just something that I came up with as an invention over there, and I think that a flag is not nearly as interesting as the process that I went about trying to imagine an image that might be of interest or be something that we do. And it is now the time, I think, for a lot of our artists, a lot of our young people as well as old, a lot of people who are into music and people who think deeply about Southern culture to really step up and really search out for these things, these images that actually connect with various parts of the brain, that help us make an emotional connection and an identity with people that look different from us, that actually acknowledge our collective history and the injuries that have happened, and also point towards a path that is going to take us forward. Okay, so this is an invitation. This is actually a call for all the people in the community to actually think deeply about what are the things that speak about a collective experience, that actually help us see not each other as a threat, but the people that have a common destiny. We who have survived and have chosen out of our free will to come together as a people and build a nation and actually be responsive and be responsible stewards for the place that we have inherited, so that our children and grandchildren and every generation after that would actually become a better future, will actually have a better future. With that, I'm going to thank you for your kind attention and your patience as you're going through this discussion. I look forward to actually engaging us in a dialogue, and I want to invite our local civic leaders of our community, leaders of religious communities, people in education, people in law enforcement, people that speak on behalf of the rights of minorities, to kind of speak up and step up and be part of that process, be part of this conversation, engage each other in a creative way so that we can actually identify those things that help us come together, and we can finally move forward and actually address many of the things that I started this talk with you. So with that, I thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much, and have a great day.